had a chance to talk to Jack Naneek, host of a new podcast called Mormon Awakenings.
Gorgeous, baby. You're gorgeous.
This is the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. The show that everybody's talking about. The show that will become a necessary part of your weekly mental diet. The show that picks up where JoshRolfe.com leaves off. The show title that uses the word podcast 4 times. Introducing your host, Josh Rolfe.
As you know from my podcast's title, or its subtitle, Thoughts on God and Man, by which I don't mean God and the male gender, but God and humankind. You have to say that these days to clarify. It's been a while since I've published an episode on God. And even more rare that I mention my religious tradition of Mormonism. And the reason for that is mostly because I want to make you laugh. Now, some might laugh at Mormonism, so those listeners will be in for a treat today because it's about Mormonism. But for me, this interview doesn't fall under the humor category. I do feel like I need to give some context, and this might take me 10 minutes or less, but I was raised Mormon. Born in the Mormon stronghold of Utah. Left when I was 6 to Kentucky, where I was the only Mormon in my neighborhood and school. And then on, at the age of 9, to the even less Mormon Pennsylvania. I followed this path of what a Mormon boy is expected to do by getting baptized at the age of 8, going through the youth program where young boys are given priesthood authority to do things like administer the sacrament to the congregation and to conduct service in the community. And then at the age of 19, as soon as I turned 19, I left on a mission, went to Portugal for 2 years. And when I got home to Pennsylvania, I decided after about 6 months, or I think I was home for 8 months, to go and be with my mission buddies in Utah, where they were all going to school. And not long thereafter, I met my wife, and in the great Mormon tradition, which diverges from current modern culture and trends, we were very quickly married in less than a year from the time we first met in the Mormon temple. We didn't meet in the Mormon temple. We were married in the Mormon temple and have since raised our 4 children in the Mormon or Latter-day Saint LDS tradition. To me, what it means to be Mormon, the essence of Mormonism, is to gain knowledge. It's to learn things that are in this world and striving to learn things on a higher or spiritual, otherworldly plane. And Mormonism, I think, is about diving down into understanding these things that we're feeling, and we're trying to discern among them, whether it's joy, pain, guilt, redemption. They're the feelings that drive our behavior in this life. And not many people like to talk about these things in a spiritual or religious context. It's just a societal thing. I think in ancient world it was very common, but today's world it's not. It's more secular. Mormons, however, love to talk about these things. Mormonism embraces truth, and it seeks truth. And in our modern world, truth seems to be very relative, yet we all seem to have an internal moral compass that drives our behavior. Where does that moral compass come from? How do we know the difference between right from wrong? Is there more to life than what we see? These are the big questions that are answered in my faith. So through my years of trying to live my religion, I've had very close friends in the faith that have decided that the church was not for them. And this has always been very concerning to me when it happens, because of how strongly and passionately I have loved the church. And I've had a lot of good discussions over the years with these friends, family, and I've always wondered if their departure could have been prevented. What was it that drove them out? Was it the people? Was it their family? Was it their own heart or a better prospect? Or was it the institutional or organizational structure of the church? What led them away? So I offer that as a foundation for why I'm even bothering to talk about Mormonism. It's because I care deeply about its past. I care about it today and the here and now, and I really care about what it will become in the future. Which brings me to the interview with Jack Naneek, and just a few more observations before I go into the interview. First, there are a bunch of podcasts on the subject of Mormonism out there, and anyone who isn't familiar with the faith may get lost in our vocabulary, which is extensive. In this interview, we don't speak generically, so I would imagine that only Mormons will be able to follow along closely. That said, if you do listen and have a question on a certain subject or term, I'm more than happy to answer. The internet's always there to help as well. Secondly, Jack Naneek's new show, Mormon Awakenings, is really an enjoyable listen. Whether you're Mormon or not, he talks about big ideas in the vernacular of modern living. So while he does talk Mormonism and may talk Book of Mormon scripture from time to time, in his show episodes, I think most people could benefit from it, especially those that I've heard in the so far 13 or 14 episodes that he has published. I was intrigued enough by his show to invite him on, and he was gracious enough to accept, which I am very appreciative of. He is just a really fascinating person. I could have talked a lot longer, not just picking his brain, but we do talk a little bit about his process of how he makes an episode. So not sure how interesting that will be to everyone, but fellow podcasters out there might appreciate it, or anyone who likes to go behind the scenes. Here's one really quick example of Jack. It's in episode 4 of his show. It will give you a little flavor of his observations and style.
So I expected it to be kind of sad and maudlin, but it was very life-affirming. It was very touching and inspiring and wonderful. And funerals can be like that sometimes. And the other thing that surprised me was how many people came out to the funeral and told me how kind he had been, how wonderful he had been in doing simple things like listening to them, sharing a joke with them, expressing some empathy. And they all told me how happy he always was. He was happy.
That is his father's funeral, by the way. And as you can see, he talks about things that matter. In this part that I shared, he's talking about personal authority. And like all of his shows, he offers really insightful and unique perspective on a problem found in Mormon culture that could easily be applied elsewhere. So if you want to listen to his show, I'll put the link in the show notes. His show runs on the Mormon Discussions podcast, but can be found in iTunes by searching Mormon Awakenings. I want to add also that this is by no means an endorsement of Mormon Discussions, the podcast, or of its affiliated shows. And for that matter, I'm not necessarily endorsing Jack's particular views on Mormonism. I have my own, and we touch on this idea a little about how everyone's views are a little different. I hate when people give give a disclaimer that they don't necessarily endorse, but I'm doing that here just because people in Mormonism are a little sensitive. And I could see someone saying, Jack believes this. Does that mean Josh believes it too? So we don't get into, I don't have like a debate with Jack, but everyone needs to calm down and just enjoy what the discussion. Okay. Which brings me to his show title, Mormon Awakenings. What does it mean to awaken? It implies that one has been asleep. And perhaps his show title is meant to say that he is the one awakening. It reminds me of Joseph Smith's words, one of my favorite quotes of his when he said, "The inhabitants of the earth are asleep." That statement is either extremely elitist, you're all asleep while I'm the only one fully awake and aware of what's really going on. Either that or Smith meant something else. I interpret it to mean that we are all asleep, in a sense. I go through a lot of days on autopilot, not giving much thought to the deeper, more meaningful aspects of life. I'm not often enough thinking of my purpose on earth or my role here. So I love the name of Jack's podcast because whether it applies to him singularly, as if he is the one awakening, or to the church as a whole, or both, it's a fascinating idea and a very healthy one to consider in my own life. In this episode, we talk about the church more broadly, and we do go a bit critical in places. We are both active believers, so take that all in the spirit of trying to make the world a better place. I've maybe belabored this intro, but I wanted to share some of that before getting started. So here it is, the interview. I'm so happy to have you on, Jack. It's been, I guess, if you could start out giving an introduction of your podcast, Mormon Awakenings, and tell listeners what it's about.
What is it about? You know, I had a guy, one of the people who listened to it, Facebooked me or texted me or something and said, when you get on, do you just ramble? And and do you plan out your episodes?
That's a funny question.
And I sort of took it as an insult. I don't know if it was or not, but I kind of, he actually was sort of spot on. I don't really plan it out as much as, it's more of a venting of just what's going on in my head week by week. And
wait. So you do not, there's no outline?
Well, I mean, I guess
there's got to be an outline, because I wouldn't, I would be offended too if someone said that you rambled, because I would not call your musings on your show ramblings. They seem very well thought out, very well structured. It's definitely obvious that you're not reading. And if you are, you're an excellent actor.
No, I'm not reading. I don't write it out, but in terms of what this show is, I guess two questions. One, what is this show really about? I mean, it's really about just what I'm thinking about. And I've noticed about myself over the years that, there's something going on in the back of my head all the time. I think we all do this. We're always thinking and making connections and processing. And I think we need an outlet for those sort of things. And we need to spit out kind of what we're thinking at any given moment. That's so I think, at a real fundamental level, I think that's what's going on with it. And then in terms of how the process works, I'm more of an auditory, spoken, oral kind of person. Like I can read, and I'm a competent reader, and I was an okay student, but I learned always the best listening, and I could write essays and do that sort of stuff that you had to do in school, but I always did better speaking. And so for me, just and it's always been that way, the process of speaking, talking through whatever it is I'm thinking is a better way of getting it out.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you get older, you've probably experienced this. the people that you can really share, what you're thinking about, the chewing the fat sessions, if you will, those opportunities decline over time. You just don't have as many people in your life that you have that sort of relationship with. Whereas when you were in college or you were in high school, it seems like that's all I did anyways, was just sort of hang out with buddies and, talk about stuff and mess around and make jokes. But as you become a parent or you get married, you work, and those sort of things decline. So it's nice. It's a nice outlet for me, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, that is an interesting observation, just about how we communicate, and I guess that's been my great disappointment in adulthood. I thought I was alone in this, thinking that I have my work where I spend probably most of my time, family where, I'm here for dinner and bedtime, and then the weekends are kind of crazy. But just having those good, I want to say good old fashioned conversations, because maybe there was a day when, we were all, meaning our ancestors, were all sitting around, when you couldn't farm, and shooting the breeze and telling stories and folk tales and singing songs together. And today's world's just so boom, boom, busy, that God bless the podcast to allow us to have some adult conversations.
Right. And I mean, when I listen to podcasts, when I listen to yours or listen to any podcast, the type that I choose are ones where it gives me the almost like a simulated experience of hanging out and chatting, talking through things. I call them kind of these, chewing the fat sessions or bull sessions. That's not really inaccurate. That sounds pejorative, but this sort of, we don't have the freedom in modern life, nor the time, as you just pointed out, to just kind of say what we're really thinking today, and have the freedom to say what we're thinking today, and then not be handcuffed to it. But I think we live in a world generally, but also in our, LDS community, where we feel like we're handcuffed to whatever we said, last Sunday. Not just moving forward, but, forever, like we have to get up and bear testimony of certain things. And then we're kind of handcuffed to these views. And that's just not natural. Of course, our views change, our understandings change, our connections change. And we think that this is a really unnatural or unfaithful or a terrible thing that's happening to us. But I just think it's sort of life. And so it's nice to have it, it'd be nice if we had more opportunities to just sort of unload what we're thinking and then not have to own it anymore, and maybe we'll still think that way in a year or 5 years or maybe not. And, I don't want someone, for example, I don't want someone dragging what I typed into my journal when I was 17 years old and say, oh, you believe this, or you did all this, because, I'm not that person anymore. And I don't think that. And often once you sort of once you articulate something, at least my experience has been, then you often let go of it. And you maybe don't even think that way anymore. And I think that that's all fine, that's normal and good. And anyways, I'm digressing a little bit here, but
no, I'm eating it up. I totally agree. I mean, unfortunately, the world we're in, I think it's easy to take for granted what we're doing right now, that we're recording live for us, but for the listener will be, the past. It's an audio recording, which didn't exist up until, Thomas Edison first figured it out in the 70s, 80s.
Right.
We've got, this kind of this is all very new. And in today's day and age where, everyone's carrying around a pocket recorder, you have issues like faced in political elections these days where everything that you say can and will be held against you. And just like these words here, I'm going to publish it, and it's going to be there for as long as I have, no pressure to us. But there needs to be culturally, I think, like you say, some charity, some forgiveness for the past. And, let's look at the person today. And yes, all you have is words and the spoken word or written word to judge, but maybe a little more charity is needed in our culture.
Oh, I mean, I agree that, and I think you're saying our LDS culture. Are you saying American culture?
I'm saying American, as far as politics goes, but definitely it goes with Mormon culture too. You have leaders in the past who said certain things, and then maybe had a revelation and changed their views, and the same goes for, brother or sister so-and-so who bore their testimony last month. And are you gonna, how judgy are we going to be?
Right. And how much are we going to cling to, or rather feel like we have to then comport ourselves in order to appear that we're consistent or congruent with what we've done and said in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of a handcuffing or a limitation, particularly in LDS, circles.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe also in, general society.
Mm-hmm. So tell me kind of how it all came about, as detailed as you want to get, but I'm curious, if you were a listener of Mormon discussions, and then, when Bill Reel put out the call a few months back to anyone who listened to come up with their own podcast that they would syndicate through the Mormon discussions umbrella, how that all happened, and if you had maybe dabbled in podcasting before, or if you were blogging and that wasn't quite as fulfilling, or how. So if you could kind of explain how you got into this.
I think it started. I've always been a student, I think, of, an amateur student of things religious, of things philosophical, and then histories related to it. So I've always been thinking about those things. And I've always tried to fill my head with things that are interesting in those spheres. I will listen to books and scriptures and anything kind of religious, and I have for many years. I found that when kind of Mormon podcasts first started, I listened to Mormon stories. I thought it was really interesting. I listened to Mormon discussions. I've listened to Thoughtful Faith and Mormon Matters. I've listened to some of the fair Mormon stuff, and I've tried to pick things that are interesting, thought-provoking. So I've enjoyed that side of things. In terms of how I got involved myself, I didn't really ever think of myself as someone who could do a podcast or would do a podcast, but I did buy a mic about a year and a half ago because I wanted to interview people in my family or people that were close to me and leave a series of recordings for my kids and for the kids in my ward about how they can process, incongruities that they'll find. For example, we say things like, the church is true. And then we also, at the same time, publish a bunch of essays that say, yeah, but we were mistaken about not giving the blacks the priesthood. None of that was true. That was a big mistake,
Mm-hmm.
Or the church is, the Book of Mormon is true, but the way we've taught how it was translated. These are our own LDS essays, by the way. This is nothing.
Right.
That's
nothing scandalous here.
Nothing scandalous. So if you read the essays, then we say, oh, well, maybe the way that we portrayed the details of that translation, a stone and a hat versus this sort of glorified painting of the the curtain and the candlelight and looking at the plates, and maybe Joseph wasn't even looking at the plates. Well, that kind of, that sort of stuff, I think, rattles people. And this is coming from our own people and from our own websites. So I wanted to give my kids initially, the kids at school, some sort of, way to think about this. How do you think about like the true church or the one and living true church, given that there are, at the same time, we're making all these mistakes? Or how do you think about, general authorities and the prophet, when clearly general authorities and prophets in the past have, made massive mistakes? I mean, beginning with Joseph Smith himself, and then Adam God theory. I mean, you can go through every single prophet and look at the things that they were teaching, preaching, and they just, some of the things just seem almost ridiculous. So how do we square that with this notion that we're to follow our leaders, authority, church is true? What does it mean for the church to be true? That was the initial question that I wanted to answer for, again, for my kids at church. So I bought this mic, I set it up, and then I interviewed a couple people, and I just couldn't make any traction at all. I just gave it up.
Couple of people in the family that you interviewed?
Yeah, like I interviewed my brother, and I interviewed this guy in my ward that I'm friends with who's very interesting. I interviewed this woman. I've spoken in my podcast about a woman that I home teach who joined the church. She's from the South. She's very interesting. So I interviewed her.
And you published these?
No, I never published them. I just
okay.
interviewed them, and I just have these, WAV files on my computer, and they're long. They're like, 2 hours long, and I couldn't edit them, and they were very interesting conversations. So then I set it aside and just became, went back to just listening, which I like to do anyway. And then I heard this thing from Bill. Hey, if you want to, I'm looking for more voices. If you want a podcast, send me one. So I thought, why don't I just try just doing one instead of interviewing other people? Just do it like an oral essay.
Mm-hmm.
So I did one, and I sent it in, and he thought, oh yeah, we'll run this. We'll see how it goes. And the first one people liked, and so I did a couple more.
And that was the first episode.
That was the first episode.
Wow.
The Lone Village. Yeah. And so then I've just been trying to do it weekly since then. And here we are.
Wow. And I mean, you've come up with, that's the wrong way to put it. You have produced some really, you've had some really amazing insights, and I wonder, is this something, well, I guess you've answered my question that if you're just, coming up with the topics and then speaking extemporaneously, without notes or anything, you probably have a very full well of ideas going forward. I mean, do you have kind of an outline of future episodes? Do you think you have enough to do one a week for indefinitely?
I don't know. Is the answer. And I it's not like I'm just turning the mic on and then just blathering for 30 minutes and turn it off. I mean, I guess I'm forming the outline as I'm doing it, and I'll talk in 2 and 3 second increments, and then I'll stop and think, and then I'll go back and edit it. And then when I, have what appears to be a thesis statement of sort, or a organizing idea, then I do build around that. So to say that, it's extemporaneous, I think is not really accurate. I mean, but I don't write it out. I guess I do it orally. The same way you would write an essay, but it's just orally, and I'll go back and edit, and I'll strike things out. And I spend a lot of time recording, re-recording, editing, chucking things, because I want to find a central idea that's driving it, and then I want to have a couple things that feed into it. And
cool.
I do want some structure to it. So to say that it's unstructured is.
No, it comes across. I'm almost relieved to hear that, because what you've put together is genius in my book.
That's very kind.
And I really, for you to say, I just turn on the mic and I have no plan and I say that, it's like, no, wow, that's so incredible. So this is, I guess you are almost like dominantly auditory.
Yeah, I think I am dominantly auditory, which is nice to know now that I'm 50 years old. I wish I would have known that when I was 15.
Yeah.
But it just it helps. I mean, I did start figuring it out. I could never really when I was writing essays in school, I would dictate them into a tape recorder, and I would have to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and so that it's not unlike writing where you're editing and constantly going over and over and over, but it's done through a mic and it's orally. Except now we have tools. When I was a kid, you didn't really have tools to do that.
Right.
Now you can record, listen, erase, insert. You can toss things around, like you would with a written piece.
So this is the first time I've heard your age. I really had no idea how old you were. You could have been 60 to me. You could have been 30. I really had no clue.
That's nice.
But I really hoped you were not 30 years old, to have that profound take on life. But that just kind of intrigues me about your history going back to birth. Let's start there. Tell us about who you are, where you came from, and kind of maybe your church, gospel, faith, not necessarily your faith journey. You don't have to disclose all the ins and outs of that. But I won't stop you. So maybe just start with where you're from, where you grew up. 'Cause I do hear somewhat of an accent. I don't really hear a Utah. And it could be that you grew up in Utah but moved out. You sort of sound, if I had to guess, you live in the Boston area, or are you outside?
I do. I live in the Boston area. I live in the Boston area, the suburbs of Boston.
Okay.
I grew up in Detroit, Michigan.
Okay. I was gonna say Midwest. say Midwest.
So I'm a Midwestern. I went to law school at the University of Michigan. So I'm a Midwestern kid, and was there really till I was about 25. And then I've been on the East Coast since about age 25. So I've been here about half my life.
Wow.
In fact, I think I did the math where I've lived here maybe a little longer than I lived in.
So born in Michigan.
Born in Michigan.
And
my folks, I was born into the church. My mother's family goes way back to the early days. My father joined the church at age 25. They both grew up in Michigan too. My mother's family came out for work when she was, I guess she was born in Michigan, but her parents came out, for employment from Utah. Both her parents are from Utah, and they go way back, particularly on my mother's father's side. It goes all the way. In fact, I thought I was special growing up because I was related to Parley P. Pratt. He's one of our ancestors.
Wow.
And then I learned, however, though, that of all the polygamists, Parley P. Pratt has the most descendants, more than Brigham Young, more than anybody. There's like 60,000 people. So I thought that I was special.
wow.
In terms of the, so I grew up in a pretty typical LDS family for the area, for the Midwest. It was, and the church, they call it the McDonald's of churches for a reason. I mean, it's pretty similar wherever you go, I think. So it was pretty typical LDS upbringing. In terms of the faith journey, I want to say just a couple of things about that, because I think we're all a little reluctant to talk about, a faith journey or a faith crisis, and it's like this binary thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everybody on earth, inside and outside our community, is going through a faith journey. And what I mean by that, I think most people mean this too, though, is that, the way that we think about God, spirituality, the purpose of life, what's important, how we feel guidance from beyond, how we see and understand the coincidences in our life, or the synchronicities in our life, or the spiritual experiences, those, what we think we know versus what we believe, and how, like there's times in our lives where we really think we know something, but then we get a little bit older and we realize, oh, I really just sort of believe that. And it was firm belief because I was terrified of it not being true, but really I didn't believe that, or I don't believe that anymore, or I think of it differently. And now this is what I really think. I think we're afraid of talking about that. And we're afraid of saying things like, I used to think of God as Santa Claus in the sky, and now maybe, maybe my view of God is it's more expansive, and maybe all this language is metaphorical, and we're afraid to talk about that because then, like I said earlier, then we're handcuffed to that view, and later on when we have a vision of, of some Santa Claus, we're afraid, and I think that's if I could assess or diagnose a malady, a cancer in our community, it's that we just don't allow, we haven't just accepted this as a normal part of being on this earth, in this time.
And in our community, you mean the LDS community?
In the LDS community, I think less so outside in society in general, people are, they're open to all sorts of things. But in communities with stricter religious frameworks, they're less willing to, just articulate the way that their own faith changed. Like the faith journey is seen as some sort of, oh, he's a little heretical. This person having that faith journey isn't really clinging to the iron rod. And I think that's handicap. That's crippling.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think it's stifling. So, in terms of my own faith journey, when I'm a kid, the way I thought about things and the way I thought about things in my 20s and 30s, they've changed and grown and evolved. And, I think we're constantly adding, and it would be impossible for me to kind of tell you in a few minutes, well, I did, and then for these years I was this way. And, it's hard to really articulate it, but I think it is, it's highly additive, and it becomes increasingly complex. Excuse me, and our faith and our view of life, the gospel, God, spirituality, what the point of life, and that's evolves and changes. It has for me, and hopefully it does for everybody. I think if it's not changing and growing, then there's something wrong.
Well, you mentioned rigor mortis there. If it's not changing, then you're probably not alive, and if you are, then your brain has shut down.
Right.
So I totally agree. I think that this is, I'm just, for some reason I'm getting this like visual of fast and testimony meeting, and the many testimonies I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard over our lives, and you sort of have code language for anyone who's been through a struggle. They don't come out and just say it in a very honest, open, sincere, vulnerable way. It's usually done in, a very kind of obscure, very hard to interpret way. You sort of have to, and there is that, we've sort of been trained to, not confess grievous sins, not to showcase our sins in front of the congregation, which, I'm personally thrilled about because, I don't want to hear it, let alone admit it. But, it's, I guess, when I think of Mormonism over the last almost 2 centuries now, there's no question that today, 2017, the church is going through something that 100 years from now, I believe people will be talking about. That this is sort of a watershed moment in the history of the church. And you have sort of the, 20 or so % of us that are still going to church every day and doing the tithing and the home teaching and visiting teaching and temple attendance.
Yeah.
And maybe last year it was 20% plus, a few hundred. And those few hundred have kind of checked out. And when you look at the memberships, missionary statistics, you've got this huge increase, relatively speaking, in the number of missionaries, and yet the numbers of convert baptisms are not really growing. If anything, they're shrinking, and the children of record, those numbers are also kind of falling, and so and yet every week, I would say church today feels exactly like it did 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, my lifetime of church attendance. And I've just got to think that the way we're doing things, and we're sort of all programmed, kind of like cattle, not to disparage the church or the culture, but that, we are in the place that we are most comfortable. But if you look macro, we're not growing, and there isn't a whole lot of evolution. And that's where your podcast comes in, others where other modern Mormon thinkers like yourself that are, kind of giving an interesting way of seeing Mormonism, and your tagline, at least on your website, mormonawakenings.com, it says, "For those who want to stay but need more."
Yeah.
So maybe talk about that a little.
Yeah. I mean, I think you articulated something that we are in deep denial about. And I mean, you articulated a number of things that we're in deep denial about. But one of the things is that it's the way that I see the church apparatus today is it's this looming, creaking, legacy bureaucracy. And we love our traditions and our way of doing things and our policies and our established means. And it's made us a bit myopic about a few things. One is, you mentioned over 200 years, and you think maybe we're in a watershed moment today. I agree. And I think it's not unlike what happened at the time of polygamy, word of wisdom, and the blacks getting the priesthood. It's kind of one of these big quantum moves where potentially the whole thing can look very different. And in our lifetimes, we haven't had really anything, massively, tectonic plate shifting type of thing that's happened. Mm-hmm. And I think we're afraid of this. As part of the problem, I think, is that we have glommed onto this idea of, the church is, first of all, the only true church, the one and only true church, and it's the gospel as Adam practiced it in the Garden of Eden. It's the gospel of Adam. It's this immutable, unchanging thing that's been restored. And to me, that's just, this may sound heretical, but that's just a made up fantasy. I mean, the idea that the church had, you can even look at our own 200-year history at the massive evolution in how we've practiced, what we've believed, what our procedures are, what's considered normal. And I said this in one of my podcasts earlier, 150 years ago, the prominent members of the church were polygamous, whiskey drinking, smoking guys who believed in blood atonement and the Adam God theory. That doesn't resemble what we are today at all. Mm-hmm. And so so this notion that we can't change, or that we ought not to evolve, or that maybe there's a lot of man-made accoutrements that have been attached to the church and the gospel and the way we do things, and that we're starting to worship those things in sort of an idolatrous way. Maybe we ought to think about that a little bit. And you're going to get me started on a massive rant, but like, you're right. We have all these missionaries out there. We have zillions of missionaries, and our big solution is, instead of sending them out at 19, let's send them out at 18. That's like the big revolution. I mean, but there's this, the way that we do it is still the same. It's this monk-like, bizarre, rigid existence out in the mission field with kids who know, they know nothing. I guess that's good in a way, but in another way, why do we expect anybody to listen to, first of all, a 19-year-old or a 21-year-old? Why do we expect anyone to listen to 18-year-olds who know nothing and are emotionally, who are a year less mature in terms of emotion and emotional?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're walking around in, short sleeves and ties, and they look like, Wally and the Beaver from. It's so anachronistic. I don't mean to disparage them. Just to be cruel.
Feel
but why do we think
the same way?
Yeah, why do we think in the world of Facebook, Twitter, this splintering of media where everyone's connected? Why do we think sending people off into this bizarre monk-like is going to yield anything?
Yeah. And that's your looking back 150 years, look back to the very early days of the church when married men were being shipped off. You have, the missionary program in I guess our generation, our parents and grandparents' generation is vastly different than the early days of the church, and it has become very much more robotic. I would say my mission was a wonderful thing for me.
Yeah, as it was for me.
But there was, and I knew a lot about missionaries, having gone out. I stayed the night many times with missionaries in my area in Pennsylvania, and I looked forward to it. I couldn't wait to go. But when I went and I checked in at the MTC, I remember standing in line in the cafeteria waiting for breakfast and thinking, no one told me about this. Yeah. This is a mission? Right. And I'm sharing a dorm with guys that are just, we were all little kids. Yeah. You're talking the burping and farting and the whole thing, and just, embarrassing to think about some of the things, that were going on.
Yeah.
And I that was 2 months. That was a big chunk of my mission was spent in this place. And then you go out and it's just, I don't know. You don't want to think of it as a factory, but it kind of is, and it has to be an army to be able to control it and keep it, keep it like as a program. But it's interesting times for sure, and I think we probably are at the precipice of some significant changes. The 18-year-old change just happened. Yeah. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. But
in terms of you're exactly right though. We've industrialized. If you just think about missions, we've been kind of industrialized and standardized missions with a standard uniform, and then we, have this very structured day and things that they can and can't do. And I'm a fan of structure. You got to have structure, but there are a lot of big organizations that have very innovative and changing structures all the time, and somehow they don't seem to blow up. And like the U.S. Army, for example, they change and they evolve and they implement new methods, and I just don't see any kind of for example, why is the mission such a monk-like existence? And my feeling's a little raw about this because I had a a nephew who came home early from his mission after about 6 months with, just depression. He left a month after high school graduation. He was a prototypical, eligible missionary. If anybody was ready, this kid was. It was just too early. And then he got out there because he was 18. If he had gone to a year of school, or if he was 20, a little more mature, he'd never seen anything except his little New England town and the high school and his ward. That's it. So then he's sent to Brazil, forced to learn a new language, work, 14 hours a day, or feel terrible if you're not working and you want to just sit down or play basketball. I mean, that's unnatural for a. And then he couldn't call his mom. He couldn't. He had to wear this hot suit, and there's just so many things. Let's dress them differently. Let's have more social activities. They've been connected their whole lives. Let's have them call home. It's free, by the way. When I was a missionary, it was $5 a minute to call home.
That's right.
From Asia. So that's why we didn't call home. Have them call home every week. What's going to happen if they talk to their mom once a week? Nothing. It's just going to, if anything, it's going to encourage them. I just don't see any downside to that.
Mm-hmm.
But we could rethink all of these things. Instead, it's this, we send out, and the people, I'm going to go crazy here, but the people we send out typically are corporate CEOs, people good at marketing, who don't have any sort of pastoral experience, psychological training. And this is kind of the big, massive, stress-filled event in a lot of these young missionaries' lives, complicated by the fact that if they come home early, then it's this stamp of disapproval that they have to explain forever.
Yeah.
Like when I played football in high school, I played in junior varsity. Then I got to the varsity level, and I was skinny, and I wasn't quite strong enough. And I played a couple weeks, and then I was like, I just am getting the crap beat out of me. I quit the team because it was too hard. It's, a lot of things. I didn't want to do it. Okay. I don't have to explain that for the rest of my life, why I quit the football team.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't some sort of negative. It was too much. I wasn't physically strong enough. I was young. There's all these reasons why, but this poor kid has to explain this now for the rest of his life. And I just, for people who get through it, my mission was a rewarding experience too, but it was primarily rewarding. Well, there are a lot of reasons why it was rewarding, but one of the reasons was that I survived. I came out and I thought, holy crap, if I can do that, if I can do that, I can do anything. But why is it, why are we, there's enough of that in life. Why are we glorifying that? Let's, and we can do this about lots of things in the church, including some of our dearly held doctrines. We have chucked things in our past like polygamy. I'm griping too much. I think, on the positive side, I think that there are people inside the organization who recognize this and who are making changes for sure. So I shouldn't say it's all negative.
Yeah.
But it's it is this big creaking, kind of ossified thing more than it's responsive to the times.
Yeah. And I wonder, it'll be very interesting in the next 15, 20 years to see where this all goes. It could very well be that it's just us complaining.
That's true.
And that the church is exactly the same 15 years, 20 years from now. But maybe the watershed moment is just inside me. it's not anything bigger, but I've got to think that we're not alone, that there are many questions. I have young children, and I wonder if, will the mission be the same for them as it was for me? On this trajectory, it will be. Will our 3-hour block on Sundays be the same? Will the expectations on, from temple questions to home teaching protocol to, the various and sundry many doctrines that we, hold on to today. Where will those things be 15 to 20 years from now? Because I think you're right that we've held on to doctrines in the past that have gone away. Today, you listen to the average general conference, and there's not a whole lot there as far as doctrine, scripture, theology. It's very story-based, very, lots of examples. From time to time you'll hear, a quote unquote miracle story that, those are kind of picked apart these days online by people who are saying, well, actually that doesn't quite sound like a miracle, in the likeness of Elijah, and the priests of Baal, so it's an interesting time. There is more of a focus on Jesus Christ. There is more of a focus on, living a Christ-centered life, but there isn't a whole lot distinguishing us from other faiths. And so I'm just kind of a curious observer, not being based in church headquarters or in any position whatsoever to, change or influence things. But I guess as the armchair professor, it's kind of fun to think about and maybe make some predictions.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something interesting, a number of interesting things. One was you said, well, maybe the watershed moment should be inside of me. We'll look back and, I think there is a, in spite of, my griping, I do think there's something fundamentally important about, owning your own feelings and reactions and being positive about things and being generous, in spite of all the flaws. And you and I can talk about it here on this podcast, and, in private quarters, you can talk about it. But in spite of all the flaws, it really is, in my view, bad manners to spend, your time at church sticking your finger in the eye of everyone else, pointing out everything that's going wrong. Right. I just think that's sort of, that's unpleasant for everybody. And it doesn't mean that you're being oppressed by the group. I just think it's, everybody who's there is there for different reasons. And there is sort of an unspoken code that we're going to conduct ourselves in certain ways because we've all agreed that won't upset most of us. And when you start talking about, when you start rattling things too much, people get very nervous and scared. And I think that's a normal, natural reaction to any kind of change. I mean, I get nervous when there's things in the workplace that imply change, because then it's, there's, going to be reallocation of resources, which is code for, people are going to get fired or, change scares us because we don't know what sometimes the change brings out worse things. Mm-hmm. We've all had that experience. And so there's something about, going slow as well, and how we conduct ourselves. So having said all that, I think that really is a great insight of yours, which is, at the end of the day, we can't gripe about what the church isn't and what it's not. We need to try to revel in what it is and contribute. And, it's kind of, this don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's a healthier approach for me. If I'm thinking that way, I feel better. If I'm thinking, nobody comes and home teaches me, then I become a jerk, and not just a jerk. I'm just less happy. Right. And and I don't like being full of angst at church. I'd rather just be thinking about things differently that don't fill me full of this angst. So
Yeah, and that's really my temptation these days is to pick apart programs because I think am naturally repelled by programs. I just feel like, another program, and it just kind of bothers me. And maybe it's I don't know, maybe I feel too confined, or I don't know. I haven't really psychoanalyzed myself and why I react that way. But, I had a really great day at church on Sunday. And afterwards I was sort of thinking, what made today, different than other previous Sundays at church. And it was really just the people. It was the couple hallway talks I had. It was, serving the youth. It was, the youth, by youth I mean the 4 or 5 year olds, because that's who I teach right now with my wife. And it's just that's really what it's about. It's about the people and the relationships and the fellowship together. And so that I guess keeping my eyes on that prize is the secret.
Yeah, it's a healthy way to think about things. And as you were talking, you reminded me of something someone said to me, where they said, the church is really just the ward. We think all about these bigger things because we go to general conference and but really our church experience is the ward, and the ward are these people. Mm-hmm. And what a great place to, contribute. I mean, when I think about my church experience, I've been able to teach. I'm not trained as a teacher, but I've been able to teach kids for, 25 years. I'm not trained as any kind of administrator, but I've been able to do some things in elders quorum or whatever it is, mm-hmm. that I would have never had. And even when I'm complaining about it, it still is wonderful to just know that it's there, and now I've known some of these people for a long, long time, even people that I've disagreed with in the past, and there's just sort of a certain comfort there. Well, so when I start thinking, well, what's true about the church? That's incredibly beautiful. Mm-hmm. Where else can I find that? And I think people they're quick to toss that because of what Elder Russell said at about some group 3.5 years ago in general conference.
Right.
And what I think we forget, like in my ward, for example, it's a pretty liberal ward. Most of the people think about, I don't think I'm an unusually liberal sort of person relative to people in my ward. Inside the bell curve, I'm well within the middle. And there are people who have much more shocking views than I do, which was kind of a surprise to learn over time. So I think people at the ward level think about things, more the way you do, the way I do, and which, if you start doing the math, you think, well, maybe most of the church feels that way. Maybe they do. I don't know, but for me, it's my experience is like yours, which is if I have good interactions with folks at church, someone says something nice to me, or I do something nice for somebody else, that's what makes it really good.
Yeah.
And I don't really feel. There have been times where I thought, I'm being criticized or I'm being isolated, but I think most of that was going on in my head. If I'm just kind of open and friendly to people, I notice that people don't give me that vibe. Mm-hmm. So there's way more good things going on at my ward level, which is how I participate in church, than
right.
maybe 10-1. I mean, at the ward level, it's really shocking how much good and how little bad there is.
Yeah. So that kind of takes us to, in this very fun discussion. I'm really enjoying this, Jack. So glad you're taking the time here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to close with, we've kind of touched on the edges of the church doctrine and the culture and the programs and the ward, which I enjoyed what you just said on the ward and the value of the ward family, as we call it. And that's one thing Terrell Givens has said about the ward, that it's really a distinguishing feature of the church. He's not aware of any other church that is divided geographically as strictly as our own. And what he has said about that is, if you don't like your bishop, well, guess what? You're stuck with him. Because just like your real family, where you're stuck with your dad and your mom and your siblings and your aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews, etc., in your ward family, it's just as true. And so you're sort of in this situation where you have to deal. You have to just figure out a way to make it work. And so in that spirit of distinguishing features of the church, is there a doctrine or a principle, distinguishing feature of Mormonism that to you just gets you real excited and is something that you enjoy talking about? When you've mentioned serving the youth in your ward over the years, is there something you like to instill in them? Is there something you like to study? Just curious if there's something you really enjoy that is distinctly Mormon. And I may be putting you on the spot here.
Well, I'm trying to think. I'm not reluctant. I'm just trying to think of something that I mean, there's on the one hand, there's something about, I think you stating, saying that the ward is like a family, and, whether you like the bishop or not, you just got to deal the same way you got to deal with, cousin Jimmy or your sister or your dad or whatever it is. I think there's something really beautiful is the wrong word, but there's something so pragmatic about it, something so effective. It's an effective way to teach us. I think there's something really lovely about, and this is not going to answer your question directly, but there's something really nice about sticking with your people, staying with the people that you've committed to or that have given to you, the same way we stick with our families, or the same way you always kind of root for your hometown team that you grew up with. There's something about staying with, I don't want to say the program, but just kind of trying to contribute and being true in a relationship sort of sense to the tribe, And I think, for me, as I've gotten older, I've kind of transitioned away from worrying about truth claims, worrying about, whether doctrines are, accurate. Are they accurate theories of life? I've kind of transitioned away from that to thinking more about, why has God put me in this church? Why am I on this path? What have I learned? How has this changed me? How has this, maybe even made up for weaknesses that I came into this world with? Or how has it given me new strengths, insights, abilities? Just because I'm Just because I'm on the path, one foot in front of the other, not like I'm really working hard. I'm not even sure what I'm working towards. I'm just kind of there. I show up. You know what I mean? I haven't left the family, for lack of a better metaphor.
Yeah.
And there's something about, being part of a family or a group. There's also something about being in a marriage that's similar to this, but where you say, I'm gonna stick with it, and whether it's right or wrong or good or bad or temporarily bad, or I'm just kind of here. And there's something really beautiful about that experience. And the church kind of demands that of us. I think, though, that it's not unique to our church. I mean, other churches demand that, other groups demand that, other religions, other family structures. So what I've been teasing out in my mind lately is, what have I learned by just being in this group, sticking with it, hanging in there through, times of doubt, through times of, I don't want to say rebellion's kind of the wrong word, because I don't think we really rebel, but exploration, times where you're exploring different ideas and yet still sort of sticking with it. And I do think I think it makes sense for some people to leave. That makes a lot of sense. I would never criticize anyone for abandoning and moving on. But for me, there would have been something really lost had I ever decided to do that. And I think for many of us, there is something that's lost if we decide at some point that we don't want the tribe anymore. We're going to go. There are greener pastures elsewhere. What I think most people find is, even if the church is not all it claims to be, it's not like there's a greener pasture or something better elsewhere. That's sort of a Faustian way of putting it, right? Like life in general, when you're in a situation, to constantly be thinking about the supposed greener pasture somewhere else beyond. And if I can just get out of this, then, if there's a theme in my podcast, I think that's one of them, which is there's not a greener pasture. You make the pasture green. That's the point, and
Right.
or you at least try, and you die trying.
Thank you for listening to the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. For more information, visit joshpodcast.com. Follow Josh on Twitter at Josh Rolfe. That's Rolfe, R-O-L-P as in podcast, H. Now go and have the best day and night ever. And have fun.